This, in itself, would not be particularly significant were it not for the fact that the arguments which Dr. Crafts presents to these organizations to gain their support are entirely socialistic. Nor are these confined to Dr. Crafts. Other leaders of the movement also advocate the same principles. Dr. Crafts went to the General Assembly of the Knights of Labor at Indianapolis last month to get the delegates there to endorse the petition for the passage of this Sunday bill. He has referred to this in his speech here this forenoon, and has made a portion of his speech to them and to the locomotive engineers a part of his speech here. A report of his speech at Indianapolis was printed in the Journal of United Labor, the official journal of the Knights of Labor of America, Thursday, November 29, 1888. He said to them there, quote, "Having carefully read and reread your Declaration of Principles and your Constitution, and having watched with interest the brave yet conservative shots of your powderly yet intemperance and other great evils, I have found myself so closely in accord with you that I have almost decided to become a Knight of Labor myself. If I do not, it will be only because I believe I can advance your principles better as an outside ally." End quote. The following question was asked by one of the Knights, quote, "Would it not be the best way to stop Sunday trains to have the government own and control the railroads altogether, as the Knights advocate?" Dr. Crafts answered, "I believe in that. Perhaps the best way to begin the discussion of government control for 7 days per week is to discuss this bill for government control on one day. If the railroads refuse the little we now ask, the people will be the more ready to take control altogether." The Knights of Labor advocate the doctrine that the government shall take control of all the railroads in the country, and hire the idle men in the country at regular railroad wages, and run the roads, as it now runs the post office department, without reference to the question whether anything is made or lost by the government. This is what gave rise to the above question. Dr. Crafts proposes to play into their hands by making the bid for their support, that if they will help the Sunday law workers get government control of the railroads one day in the week, then the Sunday law workers will help the Knights to get government control every day in the week. Another question that was discussed both there and at the Convention of Locomotive Engineers at Richmond, Virginia, was the following, quote, "Will not 1 day's less work per week mean 1/7 less wages?" The response to this was as follows, quote, "As much railroad work as is done in 7 days can be done in 6 days, and done better, because of the better condition of the men. And on this ground the engineers would be sustained in demanding, and if necessary, compelling, the railroad company to so readjust the pay schedule that the man will be paid as much as at present." End quote. That is to say, Dr. Crafts and the Sunday law workers propose to stand in with the laboring men to compel employers to pay 7 days' wages for 6 days' work. This is made certain by the following petition to the state legislatures, which is being circulated everywhere with the petition for this bill. I got this at the Chicago Convention. Dr. Crafts distributed the petitions by the quantity there, and he is doing the same at the convention now in this city, quote, "To the state Senate or House, the undersigned earnestly petition your honorable body to pass a bill forbidding anyone to hire another, or to be hired for more than 6 days in any week, except in domestic service, and the care of the sick, in order that those whom law or custom permits to work on Sunday may be protected in their right to some other weekly rest day, and in their right to a week's wages for 6 days' work." End quote. Now a week consists of 7 days. A week's wages for 6 days' work is 7 days' wages for 6 days' work. This petition asks the legislatures of all the states to pass a law protecting employees in their right to 7 days' wages for 6 days' work. No man in this world has any right to 7 days' wages for 6 days' work. If he has a right to 7 days' wages for 6 days' work, then he has an equal right to 6 days' wages for 5 days' work, and to 5 days' wages for 4 days' work, and to 4 days' wages for 3 days' work, to 3 days' wages for 2 days' work, to 2 days' wages for 1 day's work, and to 1 day's wages for no work at all. This is precisely what the proposition amounts to. For in proposing to pay 7 days' wages for 6 days' work, it does propose to pay 1 day's wages for no work. But if a man is entitled to 1 day's wages for doing nothing, Why stop with 1 day? Why not go on and pay him full wages every day for doing nothing? It may be thought that I misinterpret the meaning of the petition, that, as it asks that nobody be allowed to hire another for more than 6 days of any week, it may mean only that 6 days are to compose a week, and that it is a week's wages of 6 days only that is to be paid for 6 days' work. That is not the meaning of the petition. It is not the intention of those who are gaining the support of the Knights of Labor by inventing and circulating the petition. Dr. George Eliot, pastor of the Foundry Methodist Church in this city, the church in which this National Sunday Convention is being held, the church that is now festooned with 14 million petitions that they haven't got, festooned, at least partly, with 1,7,200,000 times multiplied cardinal. Dr. Eliot, while speaking in favor of this bill this forenoon, was asked by Senator Call these questions. Do you propose that Congress shall make provision to pay the people in the employ of the government who are exempted on Sunday for Sunday work? Mr. Eliot, I expect you to give them adequate compensation. Senator Call, do you propose that the same amount shall be paid for 6 days' work as for 7? Mr. Eliot, I do, for the reason that we believe these employees can do all the work that is to be done in 6 days. And if they do all the work, they ought to have all the pay. There it is in plain, unmistakable words, that they deliberately propose to have laws, state and national, which shall compel employers to pay 7 days' wages for 6 days' work. This is sheer socialism. It is the very essence of socialism. No wonder they gained the unanimous endorsement of the Convention of the Knights of Labor, and of the Locomotive Engineers, and the Socialistic Labor Union of New York City, by proposing to pay them good wages for doing nothing. I confess that I, too, would support the bill upon such a proposition as that if I looked no further than the money that is in it. But this is not all. The Knights of Labor not only accept the proposition, but they carry it farther, and logically too. This principle has been advocated for some time by the Knights of Labor in demanding 10 hours pay for 8 hours work, virtually 2 hours pay for doing nothing. The Christian Union and the Catholic Review propose to help the working men secure their demanded 8-hour law, and then have the working men help to get the 6-day law by forbidding all work on Sunday. Dr. Crafts and Dr. Eliot go a step farther, and propose to secure the support of the working men by having laws enacted compelling employers to pay them full wages on Sunday for doing nothing. But the Knights of Labor do not propose to stop with this. The same copy of the Journal of United Labor which contained the speech of Dr. Crafts, contained the following in an editorial upon this point. Quote, "Why should not such a law be enacted? All the work now performed each week could easily be accomplished in 5 days of 8 hours each if employment were given to the host of willing idle men who are now walking the streets. It is a crime to force one portion of a community to kill themselves by overwork, while another portion of the same people are suffering from privation and hunger, with no opportunity to labor." The speech of the Reverend Mr. Crafts, published elsewhere, furnishes an abundance of argument as to why such a law should be put in force. End quote. So when the Sunday law advocates propose to pay a week's wages for 6 days' work of 8 hours each, because all the work can be done in 6 days that is now done in 7, then the Knights of Labor propose to have a week's wages for 5 days' work, because, by employing all the idle men, all the work that is now done in 7 days can be done in 5. And as Dr. Eliot has said, quote, "If they do all the work, they ought to have all the pay. But if a week's wages are to be paid for 5 days' work of 8 hours each, that is to say, if 2 days' wages can rightly be paid for no work at all, why should the thing be stopped there? If the government is to take control of the railroads all the time in order to pay 2 days' wages for doing nothing, and if the states are to enact laws compelling employers to pay employees 2 days' wages for doing nothing, then why shall not the government, both state and national, take possession of everything, and pay the laboring men full wages all the time for doing nothing? For if men have the right to 1 day's wages for no work, where's the limit to the exercise of that right? The fact of the matter is that there is no limit. If a man is entitled to wages for doing nothing part of the time, he is entitled to wages for doing nothing all the time. and the principle upon which Dr. Crafts and his other Sunday law confreres gain the support of the working men to this Sunday bill is nothing at all but the principle of downright socialism. There is a point right here that is worthy of the serious consideration of the working men. These Sunday law workers profess great sympathy for the laboring men in their struggle with the grinding monopolies, and by Sunday laws they propose to deliver the working men from the power of these monopolies. But in the place of all these other monopolies, they propose to establish a monopoly of religion and to have the government secure them in the perpetual enjoyment of it. They may talk as much as they please about the grasping, grinding greed of the many kinds of monopolies, and there is truth in it. But of all monopolies, the most greedy, the most grinding, the most oppressive, the most conscienceless the world ever saw, or ever can see, is a religious monopoly. When these managers of religious legislation have delivered the working men from the other monopolies, granting that they can do it, then the important question is, who will deliver the working men from the religious monopoly?
Abolish the law of rest, take it away from the working people, and leave corporations and saloon keepers and everybody at perfect liberty to destroy that 24 hours of rest, and lawgivers and lawmakers will find out whether or not the people want it, and whether they want those lawmakers.
There are plenty of ways to help the working men without establishing a religious monopoly and enforcing religious observance upon all. There is another point that comes in right here. Those who are asking for the law and those who work for it are those who compel the people to work on Sunday. In the Illinois State Sunday Convention in Chicago last month, it was stated in the first speech made in the convention, quote, "We remember how that the working men are compelled to desecrate the Sabbath by the great corporations." The very next sentence was, quote, "We remember also that the stockholders, the owners of these railroads, are members of the churches, that they sit in the pews and bow their heads in the house of God on the Sabbath day." End quote.
That is only saying that there are hypocrites in this world. What has it to do with this proposed law?
I am coming to that. It has a good deal to do with it. The stockholders who own the railroads act in this way, those men said. And it was stated by a minister in that convention that the railroad president told him that there were more petitions for Sunday trains from preachers than from any other class.
There are a lot of hypocrites among the preachers then.
Precisely. Although you yourself have said it. I confess I have not the heart to dispute it.
I do not find any fault with that statement. If it is true, it does not touch this question.
If these preachers and church members will not keep the Sabbath in obedience to what they say is the commandment of God, will they keep it in obedience to the command of the state?
Certainly the hard-working man needs rest. The preachers, church members, and millionaires may do as they please. The bill comes in here and says that the national government, taking part of the jurisdiction of the civil government of the United States by a concession made by the states, by virtue of its control of interstate commerce, and the post office business, and the Army and Navy, will take advantage of what the states have given to the general government in the way of jurisdiction, and will not introduce practices which destroy the Sabbath in the states. That is the object of this legislation. That is all that is undertaken here. It is simply an act proposing to make efficient the Sunday rest laws of the state, and nothing else.
But those laws are to be enforced, if at all, by those who are so strongly in favor of them.
No, by the state. If these people were in favor of them, or not in favor of them, or violated them, that is another thing. A man may be for a law which he violates. A great many of the strongest temperance people in the world use intoxicating liquors. They say that they realize the evil, and that they are in favor of the enactment of law which will extirpate those evils. The strongest advocates I have ever seen of temperance legislation are men who have come to realize that the grave is just ahead of them. They cannot get rid of the appetite, but they pray the government for legislation that will save the boys.
That is all right. I am in favor of prohibition straight, but not Sunday prohibition.
You cannot adduce a man's practice as a reply to the argument on a question that touches the public good. It does not vitiate a man's principle because he fails to live up to it himself.
But the secret of the whole matter is this: as an argument for the Sunday law, these men assert that the great railroad corporations desecrate the Sabbath, and by persistently running Sunday trains, also compel the railroad men to work and to desecrate the day. They at the same time assert that the men who own the railroads belong to the churches. If then, the railroads compel their men to desecrate the day, and the owners of the railroads are church members, then who is it but the church members that are compelling people to desecrate the day? Further than this, they quoted at Chicago the statement of a railroad president, that the roads get more requests for Sunday trains signed by preachers than they do from other people. But as the church members own the railroads, and the preachers request them to run Sunday trains, then who is to blame for the desecration of the day but the preachers and their own church members? Can't the preachers stop asking for Sunday trains without being compelled to do so by the civil law? In the Chicago Convention last month, November 20th and 21, Dr. Knowles, who is secretary of this National Sunday Law Union, said that by the influence of William E. Dodge, even after his death, the Delaware and Lackawanna Railroad Company had resisted the temptation to run trains on Sunday until the present year. But 500 ministers met in conference in New York and used competing lines on Sunday, and by this the hands of the Sunday Observance Committee have been tied ever since. After that, when the Delaware and Lackawanna directors were asked not to run Sunday trains, they replied, "How can you come to us pleading for us to run no trains on Sunday, when your preachers by the hundreds on Sunday use our rival lines, which do run on Sunday? If your preachers ride on Sunday trains on other roads, we cannot see why they and other people cannot ride on our trains on Sunday. And if it is all right for these other roads to run trains on Sunday, and certainly ministers of the gospel would not ride on them if it were wrong, then we cannot see how it can be such a great wrong for us to run Sunday trains." End quote. That is a very proper answer. No wonder the Sunday Committee's hands are tied by it. And yet that very conference of 500 preachers, assembled in New York last summer, took the first decided step toward the organization of the National Sunday Association, of which Dr. Knowles himself is secretary. By these facts there is presented the following condition of things: 1. Church members own the railroads. 2. Preachers sign requests for Sunday trains. 3. The church members grant the request of the preachers for Sunday trains, and the preachers ride on the Sunday trains, and other church members go on Sunday excursions. 4. Then the whole company, preachers and church members, together petition Congress and the state legislatures to make a law stopping all Sunday trains. That is to say, they want the legislatures, state and national, to compel their own railroad-owning church members not to grant the request of the preachers for Sunday trains. In other words, they want the civil power to compel them all, preachers and church members, to act as they all say that Christians ought to act. And they insist upon quoting all the time the commandment of God, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." But if they will not obey the commandment of God, which they themselves acknowledge and quote, what assurance have we that they will obey the law of Congress or state legislature when they get it, especially as it will rest entirely with themselves to see that the law is enforced? Will they compel themselves by civil law to do what they themselves will not otherwise do? The sum of this whole matter is that they want the civil power to enforce church discipline, and that not only upon themselves, but upon everybody else. The whole system, and all the pretensions upon which this Sunday law is demanded are crooked. As to the enforcement of the law, it will fall to those who are working to get it, because certainly those who do not want it will not enforce it, and the officers of the law are not given to the enforcement of laws which are not supported by public opinion. This is proved by the fact that the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago now have Sunday laws that ought to satisfy any reasonable person, and yet not one of them is enforced. And the preachers of that city and state, instead of seeing that these are enforced, call convention after convention to work up more Sunday laws, both state and national. What then is the next intention? It is to make it a political question in both state and nation, and make the enactment and enforcement of Sunday laws the price of votes and political support. This is proved by the following resolutions adopted by the Elgin Sunday Law Convention. Quote, resolved, that we look with shame and sorrow on the non-observance of the Sabbath by many Christian people, and that the custom prevails with them of purchasing Sabbath newspapers, engaging in and patronizing Sabbath business and travel, and in many instances giving themselves to pleasure and self-indulgence, setting aside by neglect and indifference the great duties and privileges which God's day brings them. Resolved, that we give our votes and support to those candidates, or political officers, who will pledge themselves to vote for the enactment and enforcing of statutes in favor of the civil Sabbath. End quote. Such a resolution as this last may work in Illinois, though it is doubtful, but with their own statement made in that convention, it is certain that this resolution can never work under the Constitution of the United States. They stated in the convention that the Sabbath is quote-unquote, the test of all religion. To demand that candidates or political officers shall pledge themselves to vote for the enactment and enforcement of statutes in favor of the Sabbath is, therefore, to require a religious test as a qualification for office. The national Constitution declares that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under this government. Consequently, no Sabbath or Sunday law test can ever be applied to any candidate for any national office or public trust. It is true they use the word civil in the resolution, but that corresponds with much of their other work. There is not, and there cannot be, any such thing as a civil Sabbath. The Sabbath is religious holy, and they know it. And in all their discussion of this resolution and the subject generally in the convention, it was as a religious institution, and that only.
Is there any other point you would wish to present?
There is another point, and that is, that we will be sufferers under such a law when it is passed. They propose to put in an exemption clause. Some of them favor an exemption clause, but it would not in the least degree check our opposition to the law if 40 exemption clauses were put in, unless indeed, they should insert a clause exempting everybody who does not want to keep it. In that case, we might not object so much.
You care not whether it is put in or not.
There is no right whatever in the legislation, and we will never accept an exemption clause as an equivalent to our opposition to the law. It is not to obtain relief for ourselves that we oppose the law. It is the principle of the whole subject of the legislation to which we object, and an exemption clause would not modify our objection in the least.
You differ from Dr. Lewis?
Yes, sir, we will never accept an exemption clause as tending in the least to modify our opposition to the law. We as firmly and as fully deny the right of the state to legislate upon the subject with an exemption clause as without.
There are 3 times as many of you as of his denomination.
Yes, sir. There are nearly 30,000 of us, and we ask for no exemption clause. We stand wholly upon the principle of the question. There should be no exemption from a just law. If the law is right, it is wrong to exempt. In 1887, Mrs. Bateman herself wrote and printed a letter to Seventh-day believers, proposing in substance that, if we would help them to secure a Sunday law, they would exempt us from its penalties. We replied then as we reply now and always. We will not help you to put upon others what we would not have put upon ourselves.
You object to it?
We object to the whole principle of the proposed legislation. We go to the root of the matter, and deny the right of Congress to enact it.
You say that the proposed exemption does not make it any better.
Not a bit, because if the rightfulness of the legislation be admitted, then we admit that it is the right of a majority to say that such and such a day shall be the Sabbath or the Lord's day, and that it shall be kept. The majorities change in civil government. The majority may change within a few years, may change in fact, at any election, and then the people may say that the day which we believe should be kept must be observed, or they may say that this day shall not be kept. If we admit the propriety of the legislation, we must also admit the propriety of the legislation to the effect that a certain day shall not be kept, and it makes every man's observance of Sunday, or otherwise, simply the football of majorities. That has been the course of religious legislation from the formation of the papacy onward, and that is the end of religious legislation of all kinds everywhere.
Do you not think there is a distinction between a majority in a monarchical government and a majority in a republican government? In a monarchical government, the majority is simply one man who has power.
But in a republic, when you throw this subject into civil affairs, it makes a great deal of difference. Why, sir, we would object to the passage of a law enforcing the observance of the day which we keep, and to accept an exemption clause would only be to contradict ourselves. Allow me to illustrate this. There was a time when we did not keep the seventh day as the Sabbath. While we did not keep it, we had the right not to keep it. We became convinced that we ought to keep it. And we are now doing so. We have the right to keep it. More than this, we have the right again not to keep it, if we choose not to keep it. But if, while keeping it, we should consent to the state's assumption of power to compel us to do that which we have the right to omit if we please, we would therein resign our freedom of religious faith and worship. If these people would only think on this question, they would see that they themselves cannot afford to consent to this legislation, much less demand it. No man can ever safely consent to legislation in favor of the form of faith or worship which he himself professes. In so doing, he resigns his right to profess some other form of faith if he should become convinced that other form is nearer the truth than his own. He virtually resigns his right to think any further on the subject of religious observances, and must thenceforth accept them ready-made from the legislative power. That is, as the majority may dictate. The Sunday observers may thus give away their religious liberty, if they choose. But as for us, we do not propose to do it. We are going to assert and maintain our rights. And when these give theirs away, we are going to assert their right to reassert their rights. Another thing, an exemption clause is only a toleration clause in disguise. For us to accept it would be but to confess that all religious rights are summed up in the majority, and that we are willing to accept from them whatever religious liberty they think we ought to have. But no such confession, sir, will we ever make. To no such thing will we ever consent or submit. We are Americans, sir, and citizens of the United States too, and we assert all the rights of American citizens. The vocabulary of American ideas knows no such word as toleration. It asserts rights. As was said by the Senate Committee on this very subject 60 years ago, so say we, quote, what other nations call religious toleration, we call religious rights. They are not exercised by virtue of governmental indulgence, but as rights, of which government cannot deprive any portion of citizens, however small. Despotic power may invade those rights, but justice still confirms them. End quote. Nor is this all that there is to be said on this point. There is another principle involved. If we should accept the exemption clause, it would not help the thing. It would be exceedingly short. Suppose an exemption clause were given. There are people who would profess to be Seventh-day Adventists for the express purpose of getting a chance to open saloons or houses of business on Sunday. Therefore, in outright self-defense, the majority would have to repeal the exemption clause.
Call Mrs. Batiam's attention to that.
Let me repeat it. If you give an exemption clause, it has been tried. There are reprehensible men, saloon keepers, who know they will get more traffic on Sunday than they can on Saturday, and they will profess to be Seventh-day Adventists. They will profess to be Sabbath keepers. You cannot go behind the returns, you cannot look into the heart, you cannot investigate the intention, to see whether they are genuine in their profession or not. They will profess to be Sabbath keepers, and then they will open their saloons on Sunday. Then in outright self-defense, to make your position effective, you will have to repeal that exemption clause. It will last but a little while.
I agree with you there.
For that reason these people cannot afford to offer an exemption clause, and for the reason that it puts the majority in the power of our conscience, we deny the right to do anything of the kind. I ask the organizations represented here to think of this after this hearing is over. It will bear all the investigation they choose to give it.
I should like to call everybody's attention to the point. If you need any legislation of this kind, You would better ask for legislation to carry out your purposes, and be careful that in the effort to get the assistance of the parties against you, you do not throw away the pith and substance of all for which you ask.